How does a nation that is completely crippled by global sanctions and facing massive internal protests somehow manage to dictate the geopolitics of the entire Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like an impossible geopolitical riddle. You have a state operating under just immense pressure, but it consistently projects power across its borders.
Right. It creates these massive headaches for global superpowers.
Exactly.
And that contradiction is really the core puzzle of today's deep dive. We're exploring a stack of materials centered around the book, Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History by Vali Nasr.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. But our mission today isn't to just walk you through a dusty academic timeline. We want to shatter that persistent caricature of Iran as just, an archaic theocracy making irrational, purely religious decisions.
Yeah, that's a huge misconception.
Definitely. So before we get into it, I need to set some ground rules because we are looking at materials that touch on highly sensitive, deeply polarizing conflicts involving the U.S., Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East.
Right. Extremely politically charged stuff.
Exactly. So to be crystal clear, we are absolutely not here to take sides or endorse any viewpoints today. We're merely here to objectively unpack how the author analyzes Iran's strategic worldview based on the text.
We're just looking at how they view the chessboard.
Exactly. So what's the initial thesis here?
Well, the main argument is that Iran's modern playbook is a calculated, deeply pragmatic strategy of resistance. It's aimed at state survival and asserting regional independence.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the mechanics of how Iran actually operates on the global stage, we have to look at their psychological foundation, right?
Yeah, their decision-making doesn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, it starts from a place of intense historical trauma. And the author uses this really striking phrase, strategic loneliness.
Strategic loneliness. Yeah, that phrase is basically the master key to their entire foreign policy. Because, you have to remember, Iran is a Persian, predominantly Shia nation.
Right.
And they exist in a Middle East that is overwhelmingly Arab and Sunni, which, historically speaking, meant they were surrounded by rival empires that viewed them as a literal heretical threat.
So they've been geographically walled in for centuries.
Exactly. It developed this deeply entrenched siege mentality.
But the modern trauma, the thing that actually hardwires their distrust of the West, that really crystallizes in the 1953 coup, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right, because he had just nationalized Iran's oil industry, basically telling the British, we are going to control our own natural resources, not foreign corporations.
And the blowback to that was swift. American and British intelligence agencies orchestrated a coup, removed Mossadegh, and cemented the rule of the Shah.
Wow.
And historians debate the exact operational mechanics of the CIA's involvement versus local opposition. But that nuance doesn't really matter to the grand strategy.
Right, the prevailing narrative is what sticks.
Exactly. For the revolutionaries who took power in 1979, the 1953 coup was proof positive of a blatant Western operation to subvert their sovereignty.
So they basically internalized this generational fear that the West will always try to undermine genuine Iranian independence.
Yes. And that paranoia explains why Ayatollah Khomeini actually modified the core demands of the new state during the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Right. He added independence as a core pillar, didn't he?
He did. Geopolitical independence from foreign influence became legally and culturally just as sacred as the religious ideology itself.
But that pursuit of pure independence collided with reality pretty much immediately, because the first major test of this new republic wasn't some, diplomatic standoff.
No, it was the Iran-Iraq War.
Right, from 1980 to 1988. Saddam Hussein invades Iran, expecting this super swift victory.
But instead, it turns into an 8-year meat grinder. And the sources really emphasize this war as the crucible that forged the modern Iranian state.
Because Iran realizes they aren't just fighting Iraq. They're basically fighting the entire global security establishment. The U.S., Europe, major Arab states, they're all funneling money and weapons to Saddam Hussein.
While Iran is totally cut off, they're scrounging for spare parts on the black market for these aging pre-revolution jets.
It's crazy. I mean, think of it like an analogy. Imagine a scrappy underdog fighter realizing they can never win a sanctioned conventional boxing match because the judges, the referee, the sponsors, they're all backing the other guy.
Right, the system is rigged against them.
Exactly. So what do? They throw out the rule book and turn it into an unpredictable street fight.
That is a perfect way to put it. Because the international community backed Saddam, Iran knew it couldn't win conventionally. So they survived through this doctrine they called sacred defense.
Sacred defense. Okay, what does that actually mean on the ground?
It meant relying on extreme self-reliance, intense ideological fervor, and the creation of an entirely new military force. This is the era that births the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
Because they didn't trust the regular army due to its ties to the old Shah, right?
Exactly. So they built this ideologically pure force, and they walk away from that grueling war where upwards of 750,000 Iranians may have died with this massive chip on their shoulder.
A deep institutional distrust of international law.
Yes. They learned they must stand on their own 2 feet.
Which leads directly to how they operate today. Because what's fascinating here is how this defensive posture evolved into a strategy called forward defense.
Right, forward defense. And to understand this, you have to go back to that strategic loneliness. Iran knows its conventional military is still outgunned.
By the U.S. and Israel, primarily.
Exactly. So the logic of forward defense is to build their defenses outside their borders, in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen.
They're basically building a massive buffer zone to keep threats far away from home.
Yes, but they don't do it by deploying thousands of uniformed Iranian troops. That would trigger a massive international response.
Right, so instead they use the IRGC's elite Quads force to train local fighters, fund them, and bind them into a loose network.
Which is what we know today as the axis of resistance.
Okay, wait, I need to push back on this for a second. If this is all about Shia empowerment and Persian identity, why is Iran allied with Hamas?
That's the big question.
Because Hamas is a Palestinian Sunni group. They aren't Shia. Doesn't that completely break Iran's own ideological rulebook?
It absolutely breaks the religious rulebook. And that contradiction is really the linchpin of Vali Nasr's argument.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the alliance with Hamas proves that Iran's grand strategy is ultimately driven by pragmatic flexibility and power, not just pure sectarian ideology.
So the goal is just confronting U.S. and Israeli influence, and they'll partner with anyone who shares that secular strategic aim.
Precisely. They recognize the strategic value of the Palestinian cause to keep Israel bogged down on its own borders. It's pure realpolitik.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about the structural pillars, but what about the human element, the people actually driving these decisions?
Right, because almost all of Iran's current supreme security decision makers, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, got their on-the-job training during that horrific Iran-Iraq war.
So that shared trauma just forged this unbreakable culture of distrust?
Exactly. They genuinely view themselves as a besieged fortress.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because the book analyzes this massive contradiction in Iran's strategy. They've spent immense blood and treasure building this foreign proxy network, right?
With the help of figures like the late Qasem Soleimani, yes.
But it has come at a crippling cost to their own citizens.
The domestic toll is just devastating. The relentless pursuit of this resistance strategy has brought massive economic sanctions. We're talking hyperinflation, a devalued currency, inability to participate in global banking.
It's like a startup that burned all its capital expanding globally while completely ignoring its core product and mistreating its own employees back at headquarters.
That's incredibly accurate. The state is so hyper-focused on resisting external enemies that they've essentially blinded themselves to massive internal dissent.
Which brings us to the 2022 protests over the death of Mahsa Amini.
Right. The population, especially the youth, is just exhausted. They are suffering under these sanctions and authoritarian rule, and they're basically saying, we refuse to pay the price for this grand strategy of resistance anymore.
So what does this all mean? When we put the historical trauma, the pragmatic proxy networks, and this boiling domestic unrest together, what are observers missing?
What Western and regional observers consistently get wrong is that they view Iran's decision-making through the outdated lens of 1979 religious fervor.
They think it's all about an apocalyptic clash of ideologies.
Exactly. But in reality, Iran views itself as the anchor of a global anti-imperialist resistance movement. Everything they do, their nuclear program, their Look East policy toward China and Russia, it's all just pragmatic tools to secure leverage.
They're just trying to avoid international isolation and survive.
Yes. And we connect this to the bigger picture. The author uses this brilliant metaphor of the fox versus the hedgehog.
Oh, I love this concept. Where the hedgehog stubbornly knows one big thing, but the fox knows many things and is adaptable.
Right. And Khamenei has been a hedgehog. He's been stubbornly committed to this one big idea of resistance against the West.
But with all this domestic and regional volatility, can they survive if they don't adapt?
That's the million-dollar question. Iran might desperately need to become a fox, showing flexibility and adaptability if the regime is going to endure.
Which leaves me with a final lingering question for you to ponder on your own. We've seen how Iran's entire modern political identity is completely dependent on resisting the United States and the West.
The Goliath to their David.
Exactly. So what happens to the foundation of the Islamic Republic if the U.S. were to permanently pivot away and simply ignore the Middle East?
It's a huge hypothetical.
Right. Without a Goliath to fight, how does David justify his heavy-handed rule to a restless, exhausted population?
It's an existential crisis waiting to happen. Without that external enemy, the whole system might just collapse under its own contradictions.
Something to keep in mind the next time you see their geopolitical maneuvers making the news. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.